ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you on this conference and to attend this conference as well. I wish I could be live in Vilnius, but perhaps next time. Let me start just by saying a few words by the Norwegian Climate Foundation, which I guess you're not so familiar with, but we are a green think tank, which purpose is to contribute to rapid reduction and elimination of climate gases, and we do that through research, analysis, publications, public events, and so on. So typical think tank. And what's make us special is that in a formal network, you will find most of the Norwegian universities, colleges, and research institutions. They're all part of a formal network. So we work very closely with the academic institutions in Norway. Before I start, I would like to ask you who watch this presentation. So if I can get some help from the administrator to just show a Slido, because I would like to ask you at the start, what is, if you were to describe by using only one word, what do you associate with Norway and climate change by one word? Is it possible to organize a Slido for this? So here you can see the questions. So if you use the Slido and by using one word, I'm really excited to see what word you are using. Yeah, here we have some good. Oil is leading. This is interesting. Fjords, electric cars, pioneers, EV. Okay. Perhaps we can get a final answer at the end of the presentation. We can see if it matches what I'm going to say to you. Let me just start by showing you this photo. As in many countries, we have had school strikes and Greta Thunberg-inspired demonstrations. And the girl on this picture, she is fully right. What it says on the poster here is that the politicians must step up. And I think we must agree that even though there are plenty of good examples, and I will show you some of them today, taking into consideration that we are reaching zero emissions, net zero emissions by the mid of the century, we are not doing enough, far from enough. So this girl is right. So even though I'm showing you some good examples today, it doesn't mean that I think that the Norwegian government is perfect, that we are on track, because we're not. And there are also two factors that you must take into consideration. This picture here, you can see a dam which is used to produce hydropower. And thanks to the hydropower and some wind, we have nearly 100% renewable power sector, which makes Norway in a very lucky position, because that means that, like most countries, which has to remove the fossil fuel plants, we already have done that, and we have had this situation for many, many years. So that means that we can also turn to the next chapter in the decarbonizing race, which is to electrify as much as possible, and then in the more hard to abate sectors like industry, deep sea shipping, aviation, we must replace the fossil fuels. So Norway is in a very lucky position. And the second factor, which must also be taken into consideration, is the fact that Norway is one of the biggest oil exporter in the world, and we supply 20 to 25% of the gas demanded by EU. So that means that we are all also good on green energy, but we're also really good on black fossil fuel energy. And we are, in a way, very dependent on this fossil fuel industry, which is symbolized on this picture here. This shows the market value of the oil fund, because this the revenues from the oil and gas sector in Norway, it doesn't go into the state budget, but it goes into a fund which we have named Oil Fund. And it illustrates that we have built very much of our wealth upon this industry, which is now about to fade away. And that makes a big challenge for Norway, because we have to replace all the avenues from other sources. So when I said in the beginning, when you're talking about Norway and climate change, there are really what you're saying really depends on which angle you use. On one side, we are doing quite well. Like it was said, we are really good at electrifying the personal transport sector, here demonstrated by the EVs. On the other hand, we have an oil and gas industry, and so far we have been trying to keep those sectors separated from each other. But we can now see a movement where we are trying to bind oil and gas also with the climate agenda. And right now, the High Court in Norway is now trying to make up a decision whether Norway can continue drilling for oil and gas and expanding the oil and gas activities, or if this is a violation to the climate change obligations that we have signed up for through the Paris Agreement, for instance. So very exciting times. I think we should start by asking how was climate change? How has it become? I think we must start by saying, is climate change one of the most important topics? And the answer to that is yes. Every year, survey institute called Kanta, they ask the electorate in Norway, the population aged 18 and above, and they ask them several questions. And one of them is, what do you reckon as the most biggest threat? And last year was the first time that climate change came on the top. In the springtime, when we had the COVID-19 situation coming, unemployment and health were at top ahead of climate change, but that has changed again now this autumn. So this seems to be the new normal, where climate change is something that we really are afraid of. That doesn't mean that all the voters are actually voting for green parties, but it means at least that this is something that people in general is caring about. These are the two main political characters in Norway. This is the Prime Minister in blue from the Conservative Party, Erna Solberg, and the opposition leader from Labour Party, Jonas Gahr Støre. And what has happened through the last 10 years is that even these big parties are now competing on being the greenest party. Of course, they're greener party than these two, but normally they wouldn't try to compete on who is reducing most and fastest, but that's the situation now. So when the Labour Party was in government, the Prime Minister and her Conservative Party, they would try to be better than the sitting government. And now, as the Conservative Party is in position, the opposition is saying that the government is not doing enough and we want to do more. So this is a very lucky composition in Norwegian politics right now. And also, both of these prime minister parties or governing parties, they're also dependent on other parties if they are to form governments. And on both sides, you have green parties, which the Labour and the Conservative are dependent on, because they are far away from a majority alone. So this also means that every new government, they will be better than the previous one when it comes to climate politics. And this is a quite new phenomenon. And what an example of what this broader consensus had achieved, I will look at some long-term signals that many of the parties in Parliament has agreed upon. Last year, for instance, the government agreed that every year from now until 2025, the CO2 tax will increase by 5%. And that's over the 5% in addition to the annual index regulation. And most parties in opposition agree. And if they disagree, it's rather that because they want the increase to be even more than 5%. But this is really important because it doesn't cost the government anything. It rather gives revenues. But more importantly, it sends long-term signals to the market that they can expect that emitting CO2 will cost even more in the future. A second example, in 2012, we had a cross-party agreement on climate change, and the parties agreed on several issues. Among this, forbidding oil for heating in private homes from 2020. Again, a long-term signal to the market, doesn't cost the government anything, but it was enough time for people to accept it. And I don't think anyone has ever opposed this decision from 2012. And another one, a majority in Parliament also said that, okay, by 2025, we want 100% of a new car sales to be electric. And we are doing quite well with that. In Norway, buying a car is associated with high taxes, which means that it's possible for politicians to remove the taxes for electric vehicles, and that's what they have done. And you can see the results. This is a Norwegian graph, but even though in October, 61% of all new registered cars in Norway were pure electric vehicles. Going back 1 year to October 2019, the number was 36. And if you see 2020 as a whole, more than 50% of all new cars sold were electric. And this is going really fast. And I'm quite confident that by 2025, 100% of the new car sale will be electric. And another one, in 2018, the government, broad majority in Parliament also agreed that by 2026, cruise ships are not allowed to travel in and out of the most beautiful fjords in Norway, which are also on the UNESCO World Heritage List, if they emit emissions. And that also gave a signal to the market saying that, okay, if you are to build a new boat, you must take this into consideration if you want to sail in the Norwegian fjords. And this, of course, has met strong opposition from market players, especially the big cruise lines. But they haven't disagreed on the target itself, but it's more on the timeline. And I think that's very, very interesting. And now in Norway, I think many of the political parties, they would like to extend this to all the fjords, or at least many more fjords, by, say, 2030. Again, a long-term signal to the market driving innovation. And as we can see here is a new actor who has said that, okay, we want to be a market player in this new environment. And this is a zero-emission cruise boat running on battery, so no emissions, it's completely emission-free. And this is an example of innovation which is driven by the new climate regulation. The second thing, success story from Norway is the way we have used the public procurements. That means every year the public sector, from government level to local level, we spend hundreds of billions of Norwegian kroner on buying goods and stuff and services. What if we use this muscle to drive innovation and to ask for zero emission solutions? And here's one example. When the county where I'm based in, the Vestland County in Norway, when they were to sign new contracts for the ferries, we were many saying that, okay, why don't you ask for zero emission technologies? And they did. And in 2015, we got the first battery-driven car and passenger ferry. The interesting thing is that this was a pilot project. And now, 5 years later, this pilot project, that's now the new standard. And we have more than 50, I think perhaps it's nearly 70 ferries that will be emission-free, coming into service within the next few years. So this is a revolution. Another example is the high-speed passenger ferry. Again, the county, which is buying the services from the different operators, they are now about to sign new contracts for a new long-term period. And again, they want to ask for zero-emission technologies. And again, if you do it one place, then you can adopt it and copy it other places. The same as we did with the car ferries. We also see that this also brings new business. Because of the stories from the maritime, electrification in the maritime sector, one of the battery producers called, from one of the big ones in Canada, they moved the headquarters to Bergen in Norway because of what was going on in the maritime sector. They wanted to be closer to the end market. And last week, Panasonic announced that they also want to build a factory for battery production in Norway. And I'm sure that what we have done with car traffic and at sea is really helping these big industry players to come to Norway. And this is really what it's about, especially for a country like Norway, where you have also to not only cut emissions, but to create new jobs in new sectors, which is not oil and gas. And another positive thing is that this has also affected the private sector. Here you have the Heidelberg Cement, a big company, together with a Norwegian agriculture company. They were saying that we want to do the same. This is a cargo ship. There are 300 of them traveling up and down the coast of Norway. And they said that if we sign a long-term contract, we will ask for zero emission technology only. And when this comes into operation in 2023, which is the goal, this will be the first of its kind. And then again, you have proven that it's possible. And then other players can do the same, copy and paste. And we also see it in different sectors. I've shown a lot from the maritime because we're close to the sea. But also in the building sector, 40% of the emissions come from the building sector, direct and indirect emissions included. And many local municipalities in Norway and also the state, they're now saying that, okay, if you want to build something for me, you must at least guarantee that the construction site is not using fossil fuel. And the next target is to be an emission-free construction site. And this is something that you can ask the operator and demand from you to the operator, which they will have to fulfill. And it's possible. This machine here is driven on batteries. And again, taxis. We regulate the taxi markets, which also give us an opportunity to ask for zero emissions taxis. And this is Vestland County, again, where I come from. From April the 1st, 2024, only zero emission taxis will be allowed in the whole region. And this is also affecting the other regions in Norway, because we don't want to be less green than Western County. All the other countries want to do the same. So it's about being the first mover. But this will not be an easy task for Norway. From 1990 till 2019, we have only seen a decrease of 2.3% in emissions. And this is both because of the oil and gas industry, but also because we already have a renewable power system, which means that our industry, which is heavily dependent on electricity, is also quite clean compared to many other countries. That also makes us in the position that we should really take on the job to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors. And some of them you will find in the transport sector. So my point is that very often we focus on climate change. We say that, okay, the state, the government must do something. But from my experience, it's that you need some projects, you need some pioneers. That can be a businessman, that can be a local community, that can be an investor, and then you need these flagship projects. And when you have them, you have illustrated it's possible, and you scale up, and that's how we solve the climate change problem. So I don't know, that's my presentation. The clock went really fast now, but I went through all the slides. But if it's possible, before questions, to just see the finalized word cloud from the Slido. Could the organizers? Yeah, I think this is a very, very good picture of what I would say myself. That when I ask you about Norway and climate change, oil is one of the words you really think of, and that's correct. We are in a big, big dilemma in Norway because we have to remove the biggest engine, economic engine in Norway. And we're also doing quite well when it comes to some parts of the electrification, like in cars. So there's a big difference between what Norway does onshore and what we do offshore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lars, for so diligently explaining the background of Norwegian climate change related policies. And I was just wondering that probably these policies were not so high on the political agenda all the time. So what was this tipping point, how these policies came to the top of the political agenda? But since we have 5 minutes, I want to use this time in the best way. I would like to combine this question with the other one coming from the audience. And the question is, how important is public involvement in climate change mitigation? To what extent has the society contributed to achieving the climate change targets in Norway? So what was the tipping point bringing this issue to the political agenda and the role of the society? Thank you.
Well, to be honest with you, I think one of the main reasons is that we have, well, for many years, the oil prices were high, and that's good news for Norway because that means also the revenues from oil and gas industry is high. And when the money comes in, it's not easy for the politicians to think of new paths. And what happened when we got the last oil crisis and the oil price went down? More and more people saying, okay, perhaps this is what we are expecting when we have a demand-driven activity reduction in the oil and gas sector because of climate change. And so what slowly but slowly, more and more people has been recognizing climate action as a way also to transform the Norwegian economy. So, and that's why I think, for instance, when we are talking about electrifying the ferries and high-speed boats and so on, we see that this is also a part where the Norwegian industry clusters can develop and deliver the technologies needed. So it's also helping the business. So I think perhaps that's the most important thing that has happened. We have got an awareness where climate change now is equal to new growth of the Norwegian economy. And then second, we have also had many of these new projects. For many years, people were waiting for the state to do the right thing. We were waiting for a global climate deal which will just fix the problem. And I think many people now realize that we won't have one bottom-up, bottom-down solution. But then again, on the other hand, we have had many good examples, which it's like a domino effect. Someone starts very small, and then more and more will copy that solution. And the sum of that is quite impressive. When it comes to public involvement, yeah, we have, I think on this survey I was telling about, they asked the public what, from 1 to 6, 6 is the best and 1 is the lowest. What would you say is the character of the government? And it was 3.4. So obviously, people is not that happy with the government. But I think perhaps from business sides is where you have seen most activities lately. And you have now a big group of companies where not only are they doing their best to cut their own emissions, but they're also asking their suppliers to cut their emissions. And again, that's also a domino effect, because even the Norwegian Climate Foundation, we are demanding from Deloitte and other big companies that in order to be, hopefully, if we are to buy services from them, they must fulfill our criteria for climate. And from the business side, that has been a solution many can adopt because it's really easy and it makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to thank Mr. Lars-Henrik Paarup Michelsen from the Norwegian Climate Foundation for a very interesting presentation introducing Norwegian case, which is a bit further away in dealing with the climate change related problems that Lithuania. So what is your wish for Lithuania? What is your recommendation, short recommendation for Lithuania to move forward?
Well, I think it's very important that we not only focus on what costs money, but remember this: where there are emissions, there are possibilities. So I think you should recognize being like a really top player in fighting against climate change will give you advantages. It will be an advantage for the business, advantage for the country as a whole, in a long-term perspective. But I think find some pilot projects, because I think that's the most important thing in order to inspire local communities, government. Now in Norway, the best cases is not from the government. That's from cities and regions doing what they think is what they find is good. And even though it doesn't, there are not so many CO2 in every project, I think it's just important to get some project on the feet and to show that zero emission technologies is available and is possible, also available at big scale. But start small and inspire through examples.